Hello, everybody. My name is Haley, and my partner's name is Christy. And today we're going to be talking about the best ways to identify individual manatees. So here is our poster outline. We're going to be going through the introduction, then we're going to do the 5 different methods we chose. We're going to go through the pros and cons of each, and then we're going to come to the conclusion of which one we think is the best. The Florida manatee is a vulnerable subspecies West Indian manatee that is under the protection of the Endangered Species Act. They used to be considered an endangered species themselves until 2017, where they were delisted to vulnerable after a group of boaters in Crystal River wrote a letter asking for them to be reclassified. The populations of manatees are currently facing a lot of threats, such as habitat loss, boat collisions, red tide, and cold stress, among a lot more. With manatees being such a vulnerable and important species, determining their population size and where they cluster at within the state of Florida is vital for their protection. By gathering this data, we will be able to see the overall health of the habitat, as well as the behavioral and movement data of the populations in general. The methods being used to gather this data are both energetically and economically costly. Our goal is to determine which method would be best to gather individual data on each manatee, which can be a good indicator of the health of the population itself.
Boat-based monitoring is when you're counting the number of manatees sighted while you are out in the field, but you don't have to be physically in the water to count the manatees. The pros of this method is that it's cost-effective, you have simple, accessible tools, you have more visibility than a plane would have, and you have relatively low human risk. The cons is that you have a large amount of human work, a huge team, and you need an experienced team. The weather conditions can make visibility harsh. You have the potential to count individual manatees twice. You have human error, and the boats can increase risk of manatee mortality or injury. Freeze branding is an active and invasive marking technique that makes the targeted area of the manatee lose its pigment and creates an inscribed identifier. Whether by liquid nitrogen or dry ice, the cold brand is pressed up against the flesh or hair of an animal, and then the brand destroys the pigmentation of the skin or hair. The pros of this method is that it's a good way to identify manatees for long-term study. You do not have to recapture the manatee. You can see the identifier from afar, and it does not affect their movement or habits. The cons, however, is that the brand can become covered by algae and can eventually disappear as scar tissue heals with normal pigmentation. It's not ideal for short-term study and requires capturing and handling a manatee to apply the freeze brand, and it could be harmful if the brand is too deep and causes infection.
Boat collision scars is a method that involves going into the field to either take pictures or draw sketches of the different scars seen on individual manatees. These manatees are given a unique code that's put into a database. You can use this database to compare codes with other scientists. For this to work, you need a clear picture of the subject. Some of the pros is that this can be done actively or passively, and you don't need to capture the subject. Also, since documentation is digital, it can last forever. The cons are that calves sometimes don't have marks, so it can be hard to identify them. It can also be hard to identify manatees with additional injuries. Finally, when a manatee dies, the scars can become less defined.
Pit tagging is a permanent marking method that is done on animals that are captured in the wild or in rehabilitation before release. Pit tagging is when you take a sharp, sterile needle and inject a microchip underneath the animal's skin. When the animal needs to be identified, the chip is activated with an electronic charge by a scanner. The pros of this method is that it's good for long-term studies, can be reused, implanting in animals is easy and are rarely lost or infect the animal. You have an unlimited number of codes that can be generated for each animal, and the data can be recorded and exchanged easily from a tag. The cons, however, is that there is a short reading distance and scanners used to read the tag are not waterproof. Possible recapture of animal in order to read the implant, and there is some risk with injury or infection if tag is not placed correctly. Spectrogram clustering is when you're monitoring manatee vocalizations. Vocalizations of each manatee has a slightly different frequency, emphasis band, frequency range, and vocalization contour. These vocalizations do not vary within production by the same individual on different days. The pros of this method is that it's a possible non-invasive approach, and it helps support estimating manatee populations. The cons, however, is that it's a long and intense project. You have a margin of error, and you need professionals, therefore making it more cost intensive.
Overall, we think the best method to identify individual manatees in Florida is by using boat collision scars. We deem this method the best because it is the least intrusive of them all. Unlike freeze branding and PIT tagging, you don't actually have to interact with the animal to get good data on it. We chose this over boat-based monitoring because it's simply more accurate. it is less likely that you will be identifying the same individual twice. Finally, we chose it over vocalization because it's easier to conduct and understand the research being done by this method. Overall, the use of boat collision scars will help us gather great data on individual manatees' movements and behaviors. This can help us determine the overall health of the population it is in. Thank you guys for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I encourage you guys to do additional research on these amazing species of animals.